When World War I ended in November 1918, Europe was not celebrating victory. It was simply relieved to still be standing. Entire towns had been erased. A generation of young men lay buried in foreign soil. Empires that had ruled for centuries, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, collapsed almost overnight. The old world order was gone. In its place stood uncertainty, exhaustion, and grief. But for Germany, defeat carried something more corrosive than sorrow: humiliation. In 1919, inside the glittering Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, German representatives were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The symbolism was intentional. The same palace where Germany had once declared its empire in 1871 now witnessed its public disgrace. The treaty stripped Germany of territory, limited its army to 100,000 men, banned tanks and aircraft, and demanded enormous reparations. Worse still, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, assigned Germany sole responsibility for the conflict. To the victorious Allies, it was justice. To many Germans, it was a national insult carved into history. The consequences were devastating. Reparations drained the economy. Political instability paralyzed the fragile Weimar Republic. Then, in 1923, disaster struck in the form of hyperinflation. The German mark collapsed so completely that savings accumulated over lifetimes became worthless within days. Workers were paid twice a day so they could rush to buy bread before prices doubled by evening. Parents burned stacks of banknotes to heat their homes because the paper was cheaper than firewood. Humiliation was no longer abstract, it was lived experience. Just as Germany began to stabilize in the late 1920s, the global Great Depression shattered what little recovery had occurred. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment soared into the millions. Democracy appeared weak and ineffective, and in times of chaos, people searched desperately for certainty. Into this atmosphere stepped Adolf Hitler, a former soldier who had witnessed Germany's surrender firsthand. He possessed no extraordinary military genius at this stage, but he understood something more powerful: emotion. He spoke not just about economics or policy, but about pride. He told Germans they had been betrayed from within. He blamed political elites, foreign powers, and minorities. He offered simple explanations for complex suffering. Most importantly, he offered hope wrapped in anger. Hitler's National Socialist movement grew rapidly. Rallies became theatrical spectacles of unity and strength. Propaganda painted a vision of rebirth. By 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within months, democracy unraveled. The Reichstag fire became justification for emergency powers. Political opponents were arrested. Independent media was silenced. Fear replaced debate. Germany transformed from a struggling republic into a totalitarian state with astonishing speed. But internal control was only the beginning. Hitler believed Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, to expand and thrive. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France protested, but they did not intervene. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, welcomed by many cheering crowds. Later that year, at the Munich Conference, European leaders allowed Hitler to take parts of Czechoslovakia in the name of preserving peace. It was called appeasement, the belief that satisfying limited demands would prevent a larger war. Instead, it emboldened aggression. By the summer of 1939, Europe stood on a knife's edge. Diplomatic tensions intensified. Secret agreements were signed. Then, on September 1, German forces invaded Poland using a strategy of rapid, overwhelming force known as blitzkrieg. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The attempt to contain resentment through compromise had failed. The wounds left after World War I had never healed, they had only hardened. The Second World War did not explode from nowhere. It was born from unresolved anger, economic collapse, political extremism, and the dangerous illusion that peace could be preserved without confronting rising tyranny. The world had hoped the horrors of the First World War would be enough to prevent another. Instead, those very horrors laid. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the world witnessed a terrifying new kind of warfare. It was fast, it was coordinated, it was overwhelming. The strategy was called Blitzkrieg's Lightning War. Instead of the slow, grinding trench battles of World War I, this was modern destruction unleashed with precision. Fighter planes screamed across the sky, bombing communication lines and airfields. Tanks rolled forward in tight formations, smashing through defensive positions. Mechanized infantry followed, exploiting chaos before defenders could reorganize. Poland fought bravely, but within weeks its defenses collapsed. The country was carved apart between Germany and the Soviet Union, who had secretly agreed to divide it under a non-aggression pact. For the people of Poland, it was not just defeat. It was occupation, fear, and the beginning of unimaginable suffering. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but for months little changed on the Western Front. This uneasy period became known as the Phony War. Soldiers waited in trenches. Civilians listened anxiously to radios. Europe held its breath, but in April 1940 the waiting ended. Germany struck north, invading Denmark and Norway to secure vital supply routes. Both fell quickly. Then in May, the real storm began. German forces surged into Belgium and the Netherlands, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line that France had built along its border. The Allies had prepared for a repeat of World War I. They were not ready for the speed of Blitzkrieg. Tanks cut through the Ardennes forest, an area thought impassable. Within days, Allied forces were surrounded. Communication broke down, panic spread. The Netherlands surrendered after devastating air raids flattened parts of Rotterdam. Belgium soon followed. France, a nation that had once dominated Europe, collapsed with shocking speed. In just 6 weeks, German troops marched into Paris. The city that symbolized culture, art, and revolution now lay silent under occupation. French soldiers laid down their arms. The government fled. For millions of civilians, the reality of foreign rule set in overnight. But amid the collapse came one of the war's most extraordinary moments. On the beaches of Dunkirk, more than 300,000 British and Allied soldiers were trapped against the sea, surrounded by advancing German forces. It seemed certain they would be captured or killed. Then something remarkable happened. In a massive evacuation effort, military ships and civilian boats crossed the English Channel under constant air attack. Fishermen, ferry captains, and private boat owners joined the rescue. Over 9 tense days, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were pulled from the beaches. It was not a victory, it was a retreat, but it preserved the core of Britain's army. And it became a symbol of defiance. With Western Europe largely under his control, Adolf Hitler turned toward Britain. He expected surrender. Instead, he met resistance. The Battle of Britain began in the skies during the summer of 1940. German aircraft attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force and gain air superiority as a prelude to invasion. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, scrambled daily to intercept waves of bombers. Dogfights raged above the English countryside. Losses mounted on both sides. When Germany failed to break British air defenses, it shifted strategy. Cities became targets. The Blitz began. Night after night, bombs fell on London and other industrial centers. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Families slept in subway tunnels to escape the explosions. Fires burned across the skyline. And yet, Britain did not surrender. Civilians endured with remarkable resilience. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's speeches crackled over radios, promising that the nation would fight on the beaches, in the fields, and in the streets if necessary. By early 1941, Hitler's vision of a quick European conquest had largely succeeded, except for one stubborn island nation. Much of continental Europe lay under Nazi control. From the Atlantic coast of France to the borders of the Soviet Union, the German war machine dominated. The speed of the victories stunned the world. Democracies had fallen in weeks. Armies had disintegrated in days. But beneath the surface of triumph, cracks were forming. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, surprise, and short supply lines. Sustaining such momentum across an entire continent would prove far more difficult. Britain's refusal to surrender forced Germany into a prolonged conflict. And as 1941 approached, Hitler made a decision that would stretch his forces beyond imagination. Europe had fallen with shocking speed, but the war was far from over. The lightning that had struck across the continent was about to flash eastward, into a campaign that would test the... By the summer of 1941, much of Europe lay under Nazi control. France had fallen, Poland was crushed, the Low Countries were occupied. Britain stood alone in the West, battered but unbroken. To many observers, Adolf Hitler appeared unstoppable, but his ambitions stretched far beyond Western Europe. From the beginning, his ideology had pointed eastward. He envisioned vast territories in the Soviet Union as living space for Germany, land to conquer, resources to exploit, and populations to subjugate or eliminate. The war, in his mind, was not merely political. It was racial and ideological. It was a crusade. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Nearly 3 million Axis soldiers surged across a front stretching over 18 miles into the Soviet Union. Thousands of tanks rolled forward. Artillery thundered. Aircraft darkened the sky. The scale was staggering. The element of surprise was devastating. Soviet defenses crumbled in the early weeks. Entire divisions were encircled and captured. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell rapidly. To many German commanders, it seemed the Soviet Union would collapse within months. But the vastness of the Soviet landscape soon revealed itself as both a physical and psychological barrier. The supply lines stretched thin across endless plains. Roads turned to mud in autumn rains. Fuel and ammunition struggled to reach advancing units. Meanwhile, Soviet resistance hardened. Despite catastrophic losses, the Red Army continued to mobilize reserves. Factories were dismantled and relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach. The Soviet state, though battered, did not break. As German forces approached Moscow in late 1941, winter arrived with brutal force. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold. Frostbite claimed limbs. Horses collapsed in the snow. Engines refused to start. The lightning war that had crushed Western Europe slowed to a crawl in the Russian winter. Then, in December, Soviet counteroffensives pushed the exhausted Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow. For the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility cracked. Further north, the city of Leningrad endured one of the longest and most horrific sieges in modern history. For nearly 900 days, German forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies. Civilians starved. Families survived on rations measured in grams. Diaries recorded the slow fading of entire households. Yet the city did not surrender. Its survival became a symbol of resilience against annihilation. The ideological brutality of the Eastern Front distinguished it from other theaters of the war. This was not merely a clash of armies. It was a war of extermination. Mobile killing units followed advancing troops carrying out mass executions. Civilians were caught between advancing and retreating forces. Villages were burned, prisoners were left to die. The conflict consumed not only soldiers but entire populations. In 1942, German forces shifted their focus south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad. The name itself carried symbolic weight, a city bearing the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The battle that followed would become one of the most brutal in history. Street fighting reduced Stalingrad to rubble. Soldiers fought for control of individual buildings, stairwells, even single rooms. Snipers hid among ruins. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire. The Volga River ran red with debris and blood. As winter returned in late 1942, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive, encircling the German 6th Army inside the city. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, tens of thousands of German soldiers endured freezing temperatures and starvation. Hitler refused to allow retreat. Months later, in February 1943, the remaining German forces surrendered. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops had been killed, wounded, or captured. Stalingrad was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological turning point. The German advance eastward had been halted and reversed. The Red Army, fueled by sacrifice and industrial mobilization, began pushing westward. The war on the Eastern Front would continue for 2 more devastating years, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Operation Barbarossa revealed the limits of blitzkrieg. Speed and shock could not conquer distance, winter, and a nation willing to absorb staggering losses. The decision to invade the Soviet Union opened a second massive front, stretching German resources to the breaking point. What had begun as a campaign of rapid conquest evolved into a grinding war of attrition that would drain the Third Reich of men, material, and morale. The Eastern Front became the deadliest theater of the war. Millions would perish before it ended. Entire regions were left in ruins. But amid the devastation, one truth emerged: the tide had begun to turn. The lightning that once struck with unstoppable force was now being pushed back by endurance, sacrifice, and sheer scale. And as the battle raged in the east, another storm was gathering across the Pacific, one that would pull a sleeping giant fully into the war. While Europe burned under the shadow of Nazi occupation, and the Eastern Front erupted in catastrophic violence, tensions across the Pacific had been simmering for years. Japan, seeking to expand its empire across Southeast Asia, faced embargoes and economic sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies. Oil, steel, and raw materials were being withheld, threatening the industrial and military ambitions of the Japanese Empire. In secret, Japanese planners concluded that the only path to securing their empire's survival was to deliver a decisive blow to the United States Navy, the single force capable of interfering with their expansion. That blow came at dawn on December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor began in darkness. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft descended on the naval base in Hawaii with meticulous precision. Torpedo bombers skimmed across the water, dive bombers streaked through the sky, and kamikaze-like precision pilots aimed for battleships and aircraft carriers. Explosions ripped through the morning air. Flames engulfed the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma, while smoke rose in towering plumes above the harbor. Within 2 hours, 24 American servicemen were dead, and nearly 1,200 were wounded. Entire fleets were damaged or destroyed. The attack was designed to cripple the Pacific Fleet and buy Japan time to consolidate its conquests. Yet the psychological impact was equally devastating. A nation that had been at peace, confident in the protection of the Pacific Ocean, was suddenly at war. When news of the attack reached Washington, the nation was stunned. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The speech galvanized the American public. Isolationist sentiment evaporated almost instantly. Overnight, The United States transitioned from cautious neutrality to full-scale entry into the war. The entire industrial, technological, and human resources of the nation would now be mobilized for a conflict spanning 2 oceans. Factories shifted from civilian production to military output. Cars became tanks. Typewriters became artillery shells. Women replaced men in the workforce, building airplanes, munitions, and warships at a pace previously unimaginable. The American economy, crippled by the Great Depression just a decade earlier, roared back to life with the singular focus of war. Simultaneously, the Pacific theater exploded into chaos. Japanese forces quickly seized territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. Cities fell rapidly to their highly trained military units. Entire populations were placed under occupation. Brutality was common. Civilians were massacred, prisoners of war executed, and local resistance crushed. The Japanese advance appeared unstoppable. Allied forces were scattered, morale was fragile, and the speed of conquest created a sense of shock comparable to Germany's blitzkrieg in Europe. Yet resistance began to emerge. American and Allied forces began to regroup across the Pacific, preparing for long, grueling campaigns. Naval battles, such as the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway in 1942, demonstrated the strategic importance of aircraft carriers and naval aviation. Midway, in particular, marked a turning point. Outnumbered and facing seasoned Japanese forces, American pilots and sailors executed precise, daring maneuvers that inflicted devastating losses on the Japanese fleet. 4 aircraft carriers crucial to Japan's expansion were sunk, halting their momentum and shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. What had begun as a catastrophic surprise became a long, grueling struggle in which ingenuity, courage, and sacrifice could turn the tide. Meanwhile, the global dimension of the war became undeniable. With the United States fully engaged, the conflict spanned Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Coordinating across multiple theaters became a monumental challenge. Resources, intelligence, and manpower had to be distributed strategically. Civilians in cities across the globe now faced the direct consequences of war, whether through bombing raids, occupation, or conscription. Families were torn apart, supply lines disrupted, and economies redirected toward survival and the war effort. The human cost was becoming increasingly apparent, but the resolve of nations hardened. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ignited a war that no single nation could contain. The entry of the United States also reshaped alliances. Britain, already embattled in Europe, gained the support of a powerful partner capable of providing material, technology, and manpower. Soviet forces, still fighting desperately against Germany in the east, now found a critical ally opening a second front across the Pacific. Coordination between the allies would be fraught with challenges, but the global network of resistance was beginning to take shape. The war was no longer a series of regional campaigns. It had become a conflict encompassing continents, oceans, and ideologies. Every battle, every city, every soldier, and every civilian was now part of a single, interconnected struggle. By the end of 1942, the world had transformed irreversibly. From the icy fields of Russia to the tropical jungles of the Pacific, humanity faced destruction on an unprecedented scale. Pearl Harbor had ignited not just a war against Japan, but a conflagration that bound together the fates of nations, people, and generations. The battlefront was everywhere, and the stakes had never been higher. Survival, courage, and strategy would now determine the course of history, and the war that had begun in Europe had truly become a global inferno. As the armies of World War II clashed across continents, another war unfolded behind barbed wire and sealed train cars, a war against civilians. It did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words. Years before the first shots were fired in 1939, hatred had already been cultivated in speeches, newspapers, and propaganda films. Under Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, anti-Semitism was not hidden. It was institutionalized. Jewish citizens were stripped of rights, excluded from professions, boycotted, and publicly humiliated. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 reduced them to second-class status. What had once been prejudice hardened into state policy. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, millions of Jews suddenly fell under Nazi control. Ghettos were established in cities like Warsaw and Lodz, overcrowded districts sealed off from the outside world. Families were forced into tiny rooms. Food was rationed to starvation levels. Disease spread quickly. Children grew thin. Parents faced impossible choices: who would eat, who would wait. The walls of the ghettos were not only physical barriers, they were psychological cages. Inside, hope began to fade. As the war expanded eastward during Operation Barbarossa, mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen followed the advancing German army into Soviet territories. Entire communities were rounded up, marched to forests or ravines, and executed in mass shootings. One of the most infamous massacres occurred at Babi Yar, where tens of thousands were murdered in just 2 days. These were not battlefield deaths. They were systematic executions of civilians, men, women, children. The violence was methodical, recorded, and bureaucratically organized. By 1942, Nazi leadership formalized what they called the final solution. At the Wannsee Conference, senior officials coordinated plans for the mass deportation and extermination of Europe's Jewish population. Industrialized killing centers were established in occupied Poland. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. Trains arrived daily, packed with families who had been told they were being relocated for labor. Upon arrival, selections were made in minutes. Those deemed fit for work were sent to forced labor camps. The elderly, the sick, and most children were sent directly to gas chambers disguised as showers. The scale of the Holocaust defies comprehension. Approximately 6 million Jews were murdered. Millions of others, including Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and prisoners of war, were also targeted and killed. Entire cultures were erased. Centuries-old communities vanished. Synagogues, schools, and homes were left empty. The human cost was not only measured in lives lost, but in futures extinguished. Yet even in the darkest conditions, resistance flickered. In the Warsaw Ghetto, fighters staged an uprising in 1943, choosing to resist rather than submit. Prisoners in Sobibor and Treblinka organized revolts. Individuals risked their lives to hide neighbors or forge documents. Courage did not always mean victory. Often it meant survival for one more day. Acts of defiance, small and large, stood against a machinery designed for annihilation. As Allied forces advanced in 1944 and 1945, they began liberating camps. Soldiers entering these sites were confronted with scenes that seemed beyond belief: skeletal survivors, mass graves, warehouses filled with shoes, glasses, and suitcases. The industrial nature of the killing stunned even hardened combat veterans. The liberation did not erase the trauma. Survivors emerged carrying physical scars and memories that would last lifetimes. The Holocaust forces humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about obedience, propaganda, and the capacity for cruelty within modern society. It was not carried out by a single individual, but by a system supported by bureaucrats, guards, engineers, and citizens who complied or looked away. It stands as one of history's clearest warnings of what can occur when hatred is normalized and dissent is silenced. World War II was fought with tanks and aircraft, but it was also fought in classrooms, neighborhoods, and government offices. The Holocaust reminds us that the cost of war extends far beyond battlefields. It reaches into homes, into childhoods, into generations yet unborn. It transforms ordinary landscapes into sites of memory and mourning. By the time the camps were liberated, Europe was in ruins. Cities lay flattened. Armies were exhausted. But the moral weight of what had been uncovered would shape the post-war world. The promise of never again would echo across decades, a vow born from ashes. As Allied forces pressed inward from both east and west, the Nazi regime began to crumble. The Third Reich, once seemingly invincible, was collapsing under the weight of its own brutality and overreach. By 1944, the momentum of World War II had shifted. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were pushing westward after the decisive victory at Stalingrad. In the Mediterranean, Allied troops had landed in Italy, forcing Benito Mussolini from power. But Nazi Germany still controlled vast portions of Western Europe. France remained occupied. The Atlantic Wall, a sprawling network of bunkers, mines, and coastal defenses, stretched along the French coastline. To defeat Germany, the Allies needed a direct assault into occupied Europe. That assault would become one of the most ambitious military operations in history. For months, planning unfolded in secrecy. Deception campaigns misled German intelligence into believing the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Fake tanks, false radio transmissions, and phantom armies were constructed to confuse the enemy. Meanwhile, thousands of ships and landing craft gathered in southern England. Over 2 million soldiers waited for orders. The operation was named Overlord. Its success would determine the fate of Europe. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, D-Day, the skies above Normandy filled with aircraft. Paratroopers from the United States and Britain descended behind enemy lines under darkness, tasked with securing bridges and disrupting German defenses. Many landed off-target. Some were captured, others fought in isolation. As dawn broke, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted began along 5 designated beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The landings were met with fierce resistance, particularly at Omaha Beach. German machine gun fire tore through incoming waves of soldiers. Landing craft were destroyed before reaching shore. Bodies fell into the surf. Medics crawled through chaos to treat the wounded. Yet amid the carnage, soldiers pressed forward. Small groups advanced up cliffs, disabling gun emplacements one by one. Courage was measured in steps taken under fire. By the end of the day, over 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. Thousands were dead or wounded, but a foothold had been secured. The Battle of Normandy that followed was brutal and grinding. Hedgerow-lined fields became deadly mazes. Tanks maneuvered through narrow lanes, while infantry fought house to house in shattered villages. German forces, though outnumbered, resisted fiercely. Weeks turned into months. The summer heat carried the smell of smoke and decay. Civilians sheltered in basements as artillery thundered overhead. By August 1944, Allied forces broke through German lines in Operation Cobra. The liberation of Paris followed soon after. As Allied troops entered the city, crowds filled the streets, waving flags and embracing soldiers. For Parisians who had endured 4 years of occupation, it was a moment of profound relief. Yet the war was not over. German forces retreated but did not surrender. They regrouped along the borders of Germany. In December 1944, Hitler launched a final desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. It was an attempt to split Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. The offensive initially succeeded in creating a bulge in Allied lines. Winter conditions mirrored the hardships of the Eastern Front years earlier. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, snow-covered forests, and limited supplies. Towns like Bostonia became symbols of resistance, as surrounded American units held out against overwhelming odds. After weeks of fierce fighting, the German advance stalled. The offensive drained Germany's remaining reserves. By early 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River, pushing into the heart of Germany from the west, while Soviet forces advanced from the east. Cities were reduced to rubble under relentless bombing. The civilians fled advancing armies. The once mighty Third Reich was collapsing from all sides. In April 1945, Soviet troops encircled Berlin. Street fighting erupted in the capital. The sound of artillery echoed through shattered neighborhoods. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, Adolf Hitler retreated into his bunker and took his own life. Days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. Victory in Europe Day (VE Day) was declared. Across London, New York, and Moscow, crowds gathered in celebration. Bells rang, strangers embraced. Yet beneath the joy lingered exhaustion and grief. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. The liberation of Europe had come at staggering cost. The fall of Nazi Germany marked the end of one chapter of the war, but not the end of global conflict. In the Pacific, fighting raged on with equal ferocity. The war that began in Europe had consumed the world, and its final act, the war that had swallowed continents, was now turning against its creator. By 1944, the unstoppable machine that once terrified the world was cracking. The myth of invincibility had died in the snow of the East and the sands of North Africa. Now, the final chapter began. And it began in the sky. Before sunrise, thousands of ships crowded the English Channel. The sea was black, the air trembled. Young men, some barely 18, clutched rifles, whispered prayers, and stared at the dark horizon. This was D-Day. The Allied powers, led by Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and coordinated by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had prepared for months. The operation was called Operation Overlord. The beaches of Normandy would decide Europe's fate. The landing crafts dropped their doors. Machine gun fire ripped through the air. Water turned red. At Omaha Beach, entire waves were cut down within minutes. Soldiers drowned under the weight of their gear. Medics dragged wounded men across open sand while bullets tore through them. But they did not retreat. They climbed cliffs under fire. They pushed forward. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold in Nazi-occupied France. The wall Hitler believed was impenetrable had been breached. While Allied troops stormed France, another force was advancing with unstoppable fury. The Soviet Red Army. After surviving the nightmare of Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was pushing westward. Relentless, brutal, determined. The city after city fell. By early 1945, the Red Army was at the gates of Berlin. Germany was being crushed from both sides. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had survived barely 12. As the world closed in, Adolf Hitler retreated underground. Beneath the ruins of Berlin lay the Führer bunker, a concrete tomb. Above him, bombs fell day and night. The capital was reduced to rubble. Children were handed weapons. Old men were forced into hopeless defense units. But inside the bunker, denial ruled. Hitler moved imaginary divisions across maps. He raged at generals. He blamed betrayal. He refused surrender. The man who once mesmerized millions now sat isolated, trembling, physically deteriorating. His empire burned, yet he clung to fantasy. So on April 29, 1945, he married Eva Braun. The next day, April 30, they took their own lives. The architect of catastrophe ended his story in darkness. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag. The image became a symbol of the end. On May 7, Germany formally surrendered. In Europe, the war was over. Crowds filled the streets of London. Church bells rang, people kissed strangers, tears flowed not just of joy but of exhaustion. But the war was not finished. Across the Pacific, it raged on. In Asia, Emperor Hirohito still ruled over an empire unwilling to surrender. The battles were brutal. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, each island soaked in blood. American leaders feared that invading Japan's mainland would cost millions of lives. Then came a decision that would change history forever. On August 6, 1945, a single plane flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It dropped one bomb. The explosion vaporized buildings. Shadows of people were burned into walls. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945. World War I was over. The celebration masked something deeper. More than 70 million people were dead. Entire cities erased. Families destroyed. The Holocaust had revealed industrialized genocide beyond imagination. The world stood in shock. Humanity had reached its darkest hour and survived. But at what cost? The war reshaped everything. Germany was divided. Japan was occupied. Two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their uneasy alliance quickly turned into rivalry. The Cold War began. A new age of nuclear fear was born. And the world vowed never again. Yet history would prove that peace is fragile. World War II was not just a war of armies. It was a war of ideas. Democracy versus dictatorship. A freedom versus control. A hope versus fear. It showed how quick